so last week we covered our first sort of sub-discipline of philosophy, right? We started into philosophy of religion, right? So we covered in class, we got to talk about some of the arguments for God's existence, right, that are going to be coming up, as well as just some general sort of terminology, right, that we're using that differentiates philosophy of religion from other ways of looking at religion, right? So we got, specific, a lot of new vocabulary and terms. So the idea here is we are now, not switching gears, but continuing on in that same sort of subdiscipline, but looking at other avenues of approaching these questions, right? So this week we are looking at doubt, right? So ways of potentially questioning some of the views that we saw last week, or alternative views, right, to them entirely. All right, so I'm going to take a look here at the chat. Again, hopefully everyone is submitting their questions. Okay. How do you make up peer response points? Okay, thank you, Omar. So remember, if you are trying to make up points for missing or incomplete peer responses or peer reviews, same thing in terms of making them up, it is answering an additional question. So one per peer. So if you missed, just one question per peer. So if you were missing or incomplete for one of them, answer an additional question. Ava, how do we categorize things as bad? How do we recognize things as bad? Crimes like murder. Okay, good. So the question that you're getting at here is actually a question of ethics, which is going to be this is one of the interesting things about philosophy of religion, is that it intersects with other areas of philosophy, right? So if you remember back to week 1 in some of Vaughn's chapter 1 that I had you read, that I posted online, there were some major areas of philosophy, right? There's logic, there's epistemology, the study of knowledge, there's metaphysics, the study of the nature of reality, right? And then there's axiology, or the study of values, which you could have moral values or amoral values, right? And the moral values that we're talking about, that's the realm of ethics. So philosophy of religion kind of covers all of these areas, right? So it has, there's metaphysics, there's epistemology, and what you're getting at is an ethics question, right? And so the question here is, what is the relationship between religion and ethics, or religion and morality? And that is a really excellent question. Unfortunately, it's not one we get to dive into in this class. I would definitely get to dive into it with you if you were in a philosophy of religion class. But the question that is most often phrased philosophically around this is known from Plato's dialogue, right? So we know him from week 1 as well. And that is the Euthyphro Dilemma. And this is the very classic sort of challenge or debate about whether or not goodness is good because God wills it, right? So is something good just because God likes it or prefers it or commands it to be good? Or is it good independently of God, right? And the idea is that it is a dilemma because it's potentially problematic both ways, right? And so this sort of rings true of what we talked about last week with the ontological argument. Remember, having to do with the meaning of words? I'm typing this in the chat for those of us who, this is me writing on the board. Ontological, the meaning of words here. You remember ontos is, right, the cosmos, and we're looking for the perfect being who could be capable of creating the cosmos. And so a perfect being must exist, right? Necessary existence. And all that's supposed to, right, stem from the meaning of God. So similarly, we might have a potential worry in that if we can't derive existence from the meaning of the word God, right, that existence should be something new we're learning about a being. It's not inherent in a thing that it exists or not, right? That was Kant's sort of critique. The idea here is that we have the same sort of problem if we say that God is good, right? So if the goodness is contingent upon God, which is what most theists believe, right? Then we have this weird sort of problem like we did with saying God exists. What happens when we say a proposition like God is good? We're not really learning anything new about God in the same way, right? Existence couldn't be part of the meaning of the word God if it's supposed to tell us something new. It's either one or the other, right? It's either part of the meaning of the subject or it's a predicate and it teaches us something new, right? That's grammatically how it works. And so the idea here is if we have a similar issue with existence not being able to be derived from God, so too, goodness cannot necessarily be derived from the meaning of the word God, right? That's the idea. Okay, so what's the alternative in the Euthyphro dilemma? Well, then the idea is that goodness is independent of God, which threatens the need for God, right? So the idea is that if we don't need God in order to understand goodness, then, there's something potentially equally as important, right? Or that's undermining the sort of omnipotence, the all-powerful nature of the traditional view of God. So going back to your question, Ava, when we get to ethics, we're going to look at lots of different ways of classifying things as good or bad, right? But the question of how it relates to religion is actually only going to be one of those theories, and that tends to be called divine command theory. So we'll come back to this later in the quarter, right? But this is any sort of conception of morality which says that goodness comes from God's will. So it's that first horn of the dilemma, in other words. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. Please tell me if it doesn't. Okay. Evan, if God wants people to believe it exists, why does God not provide evidence? Excellent, right? So there are actually a number of philosophers of religion who make this very argument, right? Which is that, if the kind of God that is typically described exists, well, they obviously created us with intelligent, rational minds, right? Wouldn't they want us to use those minds, right? They obviously made us curious beings. Wouldn't they want us to be able to potentially have answers to those questions? It seems sort of sadistic to create, right, very curious beings and, have it be arrange it such that they'll never be able to answer their questions, right? That seems kind of cruel. Or to punish people without providing evidence that you believe, right? Making it maybe especially difficult for some of your creations to believe, that sort of thing. So yeah, so maybe we want to ask, what type of evidence might we expect from this traditional conception of God, right? The one we talked about again last week with all the omnis, right? Everything that stems from perfection, right? Being all present, okay, responsible for everything, all powerful. Again, traditionally all good, although there was one monotheistic religion which did not historically view their God as all good. And so they get to come out of some of these issues. But yeah, good. So it's not, again, I'm not going to be able to give you concrete answers to all of this, but there is much philosophical debate about how much evidence we might expect from God. So I think I might have mentioned this, that some philosophers argue that it's rational to believe on faith, right, without any evidence. I'm looking for nods. Did I mention that for this class? Maybe. Okay, so I think I provide her stuff in the media for this week, but a young female philosopher who argues that faith is rational. So believing in God based on no evidence, right, is going to be rational. But in this, I think I might have said this to my other class, so maybe that's why this is not ringing true, which is that you're not going to see any philosophers who are going to argue that dogma is rational. Did we have this conversation? No? Okay. So dogma is belief in spite of contrary evidence, whereas faith is just a belief, I did mention it, thank you, without evidence, right? And so the idea is that you will see some philosophers argue that it's rational to believe in God without evidence, right? But no philosopher is going to argue that it's rational to be dogmatic, right? Even about God. Meaning that if we have enough counter evidence against God, it wouldn't be rational for us to believe, right? And so under these accounts, these theists are going to obviously argue, given that they are still theists, right, that they see themselves as having sufficient evidence, right, to at least have rational faith in God, or at least a lack of sufficient counter evidence to undermine their faith. Okay. Going back up. All right. Okay, good. Lunaria, same in line with this notion of belief. Are religious doubt and belief different schools or different sides of the same coin? Again, I want to bring us back to something we mentioned at the beginning, I think, of last week, which is that belief is a spectrum, right? And so even if you identify as a theist, right, and you don't really consider yourself doubtful, still your level of confidence in your belief could vary, right, at any stage for any reason, right? And the same goes for those who doubt. And so I want to say that, belief and doubt often go hand in hand, right? Again, I don't think any of us have 100% confidence in anything, right? I mean, there are still people who, we haven't gotten to this yet because we're doing metaphysics after philosophy of religion, but, we're going to be talking about the potential idea that maybe what we're experiencing right now in this very moment is not real, right? Like maybe we're in the Matrix, or this is part of some simulation, right? If you're like an Elon Musk fan, I'm sure you've heard them talk about this, right? So a lot of people think this is a live possibility because we can't prove it's not, right? So it's not that there's a lack of evidence, right, that things are real, but there's a lack of sufficient counter evidence to disprove that we're not in a hallucination, right? So it's really hard to prove a negative in those kinds of cases. And so again, belief and doubt often go hand in hand. So I guess you could say them as two sides of the same coin, as long as you understand them as always working together, right? Unless I guess someone could absolutely cut themselves off to the possibility of something. It's like, I just believe that 0%. And then they're never ever gonna, but I don't know that I think that that's realistic, that anyone actually does that. Nobody usually has an actual 0% confidence or 100% confidence in any given belief. Okay. Good. All right, good. Why are there a lot of religions? Okay, excellent. So James, you are getting at something which is another really interesting issue for philosophers of religion, which is if you are going to be arguing for a god or set of gods, right? Why should we believe it's your god or your set of gods that exists as opposed to someone else's set of gods or god, right? And so this question is called, or problem, they're often posed as problems in philosophy, the problem of religious diversity, right? So if we're going to say that it's rational to believe in a particular religion, what sets one religion apart as being more rational or less rational than the other? Or if you believe in a religion, how ought you treat the beliefs of other people, right? So if I see, let's say I'm a religious individual and I am part of a religious tradition that is, in my mind, very inconsistent with other religions, right? Like they don't have enough in common for me to believe that they would all be true at once. My cat getting into something, right? So they couldn't all be true at once is my approach, right? So then how am I to view other people who believe differently than me, right? Am I to believe that they are irrational, right? I can't believe that they're as rational as I am, right? That would be irrational for me to believe because I believe that my beliefs are more true than theirs. So I can't think we're equally right. So there are all these sorts of weird questions about how we not only have to think of our own belief system and judge our reasons for that, but then also how to view others and view these other competing ideas, right? And so on my website, I created an infographic, since that is my current way of delivering educational lessons in the TikTok era. And that is the 5 different possible attitudes one could take at least as philosophers have laid them out. You might, maybe one of you comes up with a sixth potential option or something like this. But actually, I think the sixth is skepticism, so a seventh. But there are many different possible attitudes that one could take, right? So I'll let you explore that on your own. But that's an excellent question that you bring up, James, right? How ought we treat the fact that there are different religions? Now, I do want to say that even though my example had as a hypothetical that, I thought that whatever my religious beliefs were, they weren't consistent with other religious beliefs. That is not a necessary view, right? So some of the more popular views or ways of dealing with religious diversity involve seeing them as having a lot in common, right? And this is why I'm having you kind of get a crash course in Eastern philosophies and religions this week, is because they do have a lot of things in common. A lot of them were developed with the same sorts of goals in mind, trying to achieve peace and harmony here and now, right? Which is very different from the Western religions we're familiar with, which have more of a focus on the afterlife, right? And so looking at those similarities, comparing, contrasting, you might think, well, maybe all of the religions are partially true, right? Or maybe you think all of the religions are all true. That's a possibility, right? So there are lots of different possibilities out there. Again, belief is not this black or white sort of thing. I think one of the most common misconceptions in society, and this is what causes a lot of people to fight and argue unnecessarily, is that we act as if you have to be for or right against something, right? There's only two options, right? We live in this binary, okay? And the truth is that there are often more than two options, right? And that is, again, it's a philosophical notion you'd learn if you were in critical thinking. It's a fallacy known as a false dilemma, right? So anytime anyone only presents two options to you, right? It's either this or nothing, right? Either this truth or you're false if you disagree with us, right? The either you're with us or against us sort of thing. That anytime anyone presents you with only two options, that should be an intellectual red flag. Right? Why? Why are there? Try to think of a third option. There's usually at least one, if not many more possibilities. Right? And so that's going to be a common retort to the arguments that we saw last week. Right? So if you recall, we looked at cosmological, teleological, ontological arguments. We looked at some pragmatic informed epistemology arguments, and the earlier arguments, right, who were trying to argue that God existed, tended to make that I'm getting all my T's mixed up, that theist jump, right, the monotheist jump in particular, right, and this we understand to be God. But a common retort from skeptics is, well, why does it have to be God, and why does it have to be one God, and why does it have to be your God, right? They sort of just lumped all that in together. And so Bertrand Russell famously comes back to the cosmological argument, right? Remember going back to chasing that causal chain all the way back to the beginning and saying, what was that first thing? Russell just says, couldn't it just be the universe? Couldn't the universe have been needed to create itself or something? Why does it have to be a God as the necessary being, right? Why do we have to anthropomorphize that necessary being, right? And to the teleological argument, right, or if you recall the watch and the watchmaker, right, an argument by analogy, if we can observe purpose in the creation, we can infer intelligence in the creator. Well, if you look at some skeptics like David Hume, yes, there are a lot of things that work very nicely in the universe, but there's also a lot of chaos and things that don't make sense and things that are random and evils, right? And so why not attribute all of those aspects to the creator as well? Why are you only attributing the intelligence and the goodness and the order and the meaning and the perfection to God, the creator? Why not attribute all aspects of the creation to the creator? In which case, we are not going to get the kind of God that the Abrahamic traditions are presuming here, right? That is being discussed. Good. Love seeing all these questions. Okay, so on this notion of goodness and evil. Can one believe in God without believing in hell or the devil? Absolutely. And actually, this is, I'm going to put it in the chat as a note to myself. There's a reading I will add to the media, which is a female philosopher of religion who was a nun, and she argued against the existence of hell. Right? So she is a nun. So she's part of what tradition? Anyone know? An Abrahamic tradition. Good. Although I guess there could be Buddhist nuns as well. They technically call them nuns, monks and nuns. But yes, in this case, we're talking about a Catholic nun. Right? And so she argued against the existence of hell based on biblical understanding of God, right? So based on her, the most confined conservative understanding of theology, right? She's saying this still doesn't make sense, right? That the kind of God that is being discussed would allow for hell. And she goes through all different sorts of definitions of what we could mean by hell, all sorts of definitions of what we could mean by forgiveness, right? And all of these types of things, and how even the notion of forgiveness fits with a God, because a lot of conceptions of God involve them being immutable or unchangeable, right? So how could God forgive someone if they're not able to change, right? Forgiveness involves a change of a state of judgment, right? And so again, she's going through all of these different things. And so that is not J.L. Mackie, but it's called The Problem of Hell. So make a note to myself. And yeah, it's a really fascinating view. And so hopefully this answers your question. Yes, absolutely, you can. And actually in the Judaic tradition, there is no conception of hell. The closest they get is a view of purgatory, right? Or a temporary state where you await judgment. But again, it's temporary and not hell. Just not a state of paradise. But Jews don't really have heaven either, because the idea is that it's supposed to be created here on earth. So the Jewish view of the afterlife is very different from the other Abrahamic traditions. But yes, you can absolutely, again, there's so much variety, I think, is what is important to take away, right? And as much as these religious traditions that we're looking at have a lot of things in common, also you could be a member of any one of them and have vastly different views, right, from members of that one tradition. And that's because historically, over time, there would be certain things that would create tension within a religion, and that would usually cause it to fracture and break off, right? And so those continue to kind of split over time, right? So most people are familiar with like famous examples from Christianity, right? The split, the Great Schism between the Catholic and Protestants, right, was a theological dispute over the role of the church, right, and who has the authority to be a messenger of God, right? So you see similar sorts of issues in Buddhism, Hinduism, right, Eastern religions as well, as in the other Abrahamic religions. So, and because they've all been around for so long, they've had so many different splits. And then when you add that to colonialization and global travel, right, then you get variations of these different traditions as they move across the world, right? So Buddhism, came from which tradition? Did anyone, you might not have gotten there yet. It's a little early, but does anyone know which religion Buddhism came from? But it came from India. So what was the dominant, religion there at the time? Excuse me, does anyone know? Hinduism, very good, right? So Buddhism is one of like 8 different schools of Hinduism, right? So Hinduism was in existence for so long, even before Buddhism emerged, right? It split off into all these different schools. Buddhism was one of them, right? And then Buddhism itself has been around for so long. So it's broken off into many different schools. And the Buddhism that originated in India looks very different from the Buddhism as it moves into China and Japan, and then even as we see it move over into the West, right? And so there, again, so much variety that is explained not just by the historical influence of religions that came before them, but also by just geographical movement, right? And being influenced by the culture that you sort of move into. Good, excellent questions. Okay, Mason, what is the purpose of tragedies? Why would an all good God have need to let these things happen? Good, right? So again, continuing on this theme of potential worries, right? Or critiques or responses to the conception of God that was being argued for last week, right? Is this idea specifically that three of those attributes come into particular logical conflict with one another and create this unique problem called the problem of evil. Right. And again, and I have an infographic about this, right, on my philosophy of religion gig page. But the idea here is that the three omnis that are important here are omnibenevolence, right, omniscience, or being all knowing, and all powerful, or being omnipotent. Okay. Now, why these three in particular? Okay. Well, if God is all powerful, then God could stop anything they wanted to, right? So with the power comes the capacity to intervene should they have the will to do so, okay? Knowledge, omniscience. God knows everything, even before it happens, right? Very common conception or attribute of God. Well, if God knows everything before it happens, well, then God, if they wanted to intervene, would know when and where to do so. Right? So it's not from lack of information, right, that God is not intervening in some cases. And then the third one is going to be the most important. Okay, this is going to be the one that gets Zoroastrianism out of the problem of evil, and that's omnibenevolence. And this is the presumption that an all good being wants to prevent any unnecessary evil. Okay, so there's quite a bit in there. Okay, but it is presumed that if a being is all good, they have a desire, a will to prevent unnecessary suffering. Right? And this is not like a totally ridiculous claim. Like, I don't think many theists would disagree with this, right? They don't see an all good God as one that is just indifferent to unnecessary suffering, right? An all good God cares about the pain and suffering of its creation, and so would not want them to have to suffer unnecessarily, right? Again, not a ridiculous claim, but a very specific implication of omnibenevolence, right? And so then the question becomes, if God is all three of these things at the same time, why is there evil, right? So this is the logical problem, which is just there's a logical inconsistency between God being these three things and there existing evil. And I'm not sure if this is going to be a question, but one question you should have is, how are we defining evil, right? Because again, these words can mean lots of things. We're going to take the most basic, simplest definition, right? We don't want to build in demons and things because that's, again, presupposing those things exist. We're going to apply Occam's razor here, right? The simplest view. And so we're just going to understand evil as suffering, which does not happen when there are cats around. Yes, you're the solution of the problem of evil. Okay, no. But the idea here is that evil could mean lots of things. All we mean here is the capacity to suffer, right? So we are sentient creatures. We have the capacity to suffer. So suffering can happen in lots of different ways, right? So there are going to be different types of evils. There's going to be the suffering that we inflict on each other, right? That's going to be called moral evil. And then there's going to be natural evils, right? Evils that occur through no human fault. Although with climate change, see, that's making even weather complicated, right? But in general, we like to say things that, like natural disasters, we don't typically blame on human behavior. Although again, some Republicans blamed Katrina on gay cruises. So again, who's to say where you're placing blame, right? But for most theists, there are moral and natural evils, right? But the idea here is that all we mean by evil is suffering. And so clearly God does allow suffering. And clearly philosophers want to presume, and this is the question for all of you, the suffering that occurs is unnecessary, right? So that's the question. Is the evil that we actually experience necessary or not? And so what you're going to see in terms of the problem of evil philosophically is the critique, right? The problem itself, and then the responses from the theists. And these are called theodicies. And these are stories that make God's attributes consistent with the existence of evil, right? And so some of these theodicies involve things like, well, God chose to give us free will, right? And so God cannot both will us to be free and intervene in our expression of our free will. Now, this would explain moral evils, right? Does this explain natural evils, though? Right? Did God have to give the universe free will to kill us with with tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanoes and asteroids, right? So why do we still experience natural evils, right? So some theodicies don't explain all types of evils, right? But the idea is that they're trying to explain how this type of God could allow evil and so much evil, right, to occur. So unfortunately, when you do some of the readings, you'll notice that a lot of the examples involve children, right? And this is a rhetorical move because most of us, for some reason, are a lot more comfortable with adults experiencing pain than children experiencing pain, right? We see children as innocent, right? Nothing they could do could ever be worthy, right? And so a lot of these examples are going to use children or animals suffering, because they're trying to capture this notion of unnecessary, right? Excessive, right? What possible good could this do? And they could be really innocuous examples too, right? So one of the most famous ones of the, not the logical problem of evil, but the inductive problem of evil comes from Rowe. And he uses just the example of, a forest fire. Surely some animals get caught in the fire, right, and can't escape. So a deer, imagine a deer, little Bambi, gets burned to death, right? That's horrible. No one knows that deer burned to death, right? There's no save the deer movement that that happens on, from social media because of the suffering of this deer, right? It seems completely unnecessary, and it seems very likely, and in fact, very possible, right, that this type of suffering occurs, and probably all the time, right? And so why would this type of God allow this? And so then there are other types of theodicies. Then we get into this idea that you can't really have goodness without a conception of evil, that perhaps these notions exist in connection, they're interconnected in some way, right? And so these are known as the soul-making theodicies, right? That in order to become worthy of eternal goodness, we have to face the challenge in order to make the decision, right? If God created a world that was already perfect and that we didn't have to face, tough decisions or face evils and overcome them, then we wouldn't be worthy of heaven, right? And so the idea is that we have to build our souls up to be worthy of eternal paradise, and we can only do that through confronting evil. So that's the next type of theodicy. The final type of theodicy is known as the best of all possible worlds. And if any of you are literary fans, this notion is mocked in a very famous book called Candide that was written by Voltaire. So he is actually making fun of the philosopher who argues for this theodicy. And the theodicy goes that, of all possible worlds that God could have created, right, the kind of God that we're talking about would only create the best of all possible worlds, right? And this is the world that was actually created. So this must be the best of all possible worlds. And there's some ways in which we can strengthen that by adding the notion of free will, by kind of blending all three theodicies together, right? We could say a world that has free will and some evil is better than a world that has no evil but no free will, right? Is another way of sort of phrasing it, right? That this was the better world for God to create, one in which, yes, there was evil, but we had free will in it, right? And so that's another way of viewing this. But if you're interested in a critique of this theodicy, I recommend you read Candide. It's very short and very funny. But basically, it's this young man who it's like a epic battle version of Meet the Parents. Do you guys remember that movie with Ben Stiller? It's just like really uncomfortable. Like all the worst things that could happen to him while he's trying to make a good impression on his in-laws, like those are the things that happen, right? It's the same thing with Candide. This guy is trying to get, the woman he's in love with back, and all the worst possible things that happen to him could happen. But he keeps bumping into this philosopher who says, but this is the best of all possible worlds. Right? No matter how much we suffer. So it's interesting, but there are potential responses to the problem, right? Is the general idea. So whether it's the logical problem or the inductive or evidential problem, right? Whether you think there's an inconsistency or whether or not you think there's just so much. Why is God allowing so much evil, right? Some evil I could imagine, but so much. And so there are ways of potentially addressing that. So there are three big ones. Again, free will, soul making, and the best of all possible worlds are the big ones. Sorry, I just want to make sure I don't miss any. All right. Have you had Last Thursdayism? Yes. Is that the one with cats? Doesn't the world get recreated every Thursday? Mason? I think I have heard of that one, if that's the one that you're referring to. Yes, good. Good. And there have been some sci-fi movies with this sort of effect, right? So people being fed false memories, right? And so if you don't have a memory of that, the implantation of those memories, you would never know, right? You would never have any reason to think, yeah, good. There are a lot of really fascinating religions. I'm also very fascinated in cults. So if you're interested, like I've watched like every documentary there is there. So yeah, if you want to nerd out with me about cults, let's do that sometimes, because they have a lot of sort of similar tactics in the way that, we have to sort of maneuver and resituate ourselves to address a potential worry, right? And so you end up getting a lot of cults start by just taking pieces from existing religions and kind of piecing them together in an interesting way. And a lot of it comes from Eastern religion, right? And so because most people from the West aren't familiar with that, they're like, ooh, this is so fascinating and new. And it's like, no, this has been around for a long time. Yeah, the Nexium, like even non-religious cults utilize a lot of the same ideas. In the original Hebrew of the Bible, there isn't any mention of hell. That's right. So the Bible is made up of the Old Testament and the New Testament, but also know that the New Testament is going to be different depending on which branch of Christianity you're in. The Old Testament is also known as the Torah, right? Which is from the Jewish tradition, which predates Christianity and from which Christianity emerges. And yeah, so the stories and the depiction of reality and of God that you get in the Torah versus the New Testament are very different, right? And potentially, again, very incompatible with each other, right? So the God of the Torah of the Old Testament is very vengeful, right? So again, maybe not even the all good sort of attribute is emphasized here. Very much sort of salt the earth, very spiteful, very jealous. Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to, again, lots of variety, even within any one given tradition. Good. Oh, not to mention newer branches of Christianity, which think there are levels of heaven. So I think like the Mormons think like Jews are second to the highest level. Like they just have, if only they would just believe that Jesus is the savior, then they could just get to the next highest level. So they've got it all divvied out into a hierarchy. Very, very different conceptions of the afterlife. Okay. If God is real, how are they able to intervene? How are they able to watch over us? Excellent question. Okay, so this has to do with a question about God's relationship to time and space, right? So the idea is that for God to have created time and space and time, right, God would have to exist outside of space and time. Does that make sense? You following so far? Okay, so to create space and time, God would have to exist outside of it. Otherwise, if God was in space and time, it would already exist, right? In order for God to exist. Okay, so God has to be outside of space and time in order to create it. However, God also has to be in space and time in order to be a personal God, right? So this wouldn't apply to deism, but for any type of monotheism or even polytheism, which involves personal gods, God has to be able to intervene in time and space and be omnipresent in the case of monotheism, right? Be present in all places at all times. And so there could be a potential worry about how a being could be both in time and out of time at the same time. But then that question doesn't make sense because time doesn't exist outside of time. This is where we get into some logic time trouble. So I'll let you play around with that puzzle a little more if you'd like to, but it's an excellent question about God's relationship to its own creation, right? There are some other funny versions of that, like, let's say the universe or space is infinite, right? But the universe is finite. Why did God create the universe over here and not over here? Silly things like that, right? But the idea is that all of these should have a reason, right, for an intelligent designer. I blame Dante's Inferno. Very good. There's actually a really great, I think, more entertaining version of Dante's Inferno that comes from the Zoroastrian tradition, and that's called the text of Arda Virov. No, I'm not typing. Arda Virov. And the idea is that this gentleman takes a drug-induced trip to the afterlife and comes back to explain in gruesome detail exactly what types of punishment await certain types of sinners. So again, very much like Dante's Inferno, like, the philosophers and the artists are on a certain level, right? The politicians, like everyone gets their own space. Similar idea if you engage in certain types of hobbies or occupations or activities, right? But again, it's much more like a Saw movie than Dante's Inferno. So if you're into that sort of thing, it's definitely probably one of the more fascinating religious texts I've ever read in that sense. All right. So we are just at the end of time, but for those of you who want to hang around, I'll just say a little bit more about cults and how they relate to religions. But otherwise, I will see you on Thursday. Okay, have a great rest of your day. So cults, it's fair to say that pretty much every major religion began, thank you, Hannah, as an occult practice. And here, occult is just anything outside of whatever the dominant religion is. And so, oops, I sent that as a direct message. Just type that here, occult. The idea is that once Christianity came on the scene, they started referring to occult practices as pagan religions, right? So the word pagan doesn't even necessarily pick up any specific religious tradition. It's just anything that's non-Christian, right? So occult, non-dominant, pagan, non-Christian. But the idea here is that most cults, other than having a cult of personality, which you could say, and I would argue most major religions are, focusing on an individual, religions tend to share a lot of the same characteristics as cults. Whether or not they're harmful cults will depend on the practice, right? Which again, we can't generalize any religious tradition. There's lots of variety of practices within any one of those. But I think also on that gig philosophy of religion page, I have Ninian Smart's 7 Dimensions of Religion. So this is how philosophers classify something as a religion or not, right? So instead of just a definition of what counts as a religion, it's like a criteria, right? A checklist. So if it has these things, it's a religion. But the thing is that cults have all those things. And it's really interesting when you think of contemporary implications of what it means to be a religion, like with Scientology getting tax exempt status. So I'm watching a documentary. Someone asked, I'm watching the documentary about the Synanon group right now, which started out as a sort of support group for addicts. And then they turned into a religion specifically for the tax exempt status. And so it's interesting that a lot of cults start out secular, non-religious, and then turn themselves into a religion. And it's really interesting to watch how that happens. All right, I'm going to let you all go. Thank you so much for hanging out. Have a wonderful day.